Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Welcome to our News and Views series. My name is Evan Verplu, and I'm the program manager here at the International Relations Council. For those who don't know, the IRC strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Tonight's topic is Honduras, and we're so pleased to have Judy Ancel here to take us through the discussion. For the most enjoyable discussion for all involved, we invite you to please mute yourself in the moments in which you're not speaking. We'd love to see you on video, so if you feel comfortable, please have that on. But just know if you have any background noise or anything, just to keep yourself muted, so there's not any disruptions throughout the programs. You can enable and disable these features in the bottom left corner of your screen. The program will start with a presentation, and then we'll move into the discussion, question and answer point of the program. So just so you know, the first portion of the program will be recorded, the presentation, and then I will stop recording once we move into the discussion. So everyone hopefully feels free to share their thoughts, their feelings, ask any questions, and hopefully we can simulate an in-person engaged dialogue as much as possible. Now I'd like to pass the program over to our discussion leader this evening. Judy Ancel is president of the board of directors of the Cross-Border Network for Justice and Solidarity, a nonprofit organization that developed ties and mutual understanding between working people in the Kansas City area and the workers in Mexico and Honduras. Its motto is, "We support workers across borders and workers who cross borders." CBN published a study in 2020 called "When Fleeing is the Only Option on the Roots of the Mass Exodus of Hondurans Seeking Asylum in the US." The study reveals the connections between migration and a century of US imperialism. Ancel is one of the leaders of the Coalition for a Safe and Welcoming City Act passed by the Unified Government of Wyandotte County in Kansas City, Kansas in February 2022. Her professional career as a labor educator is as a labor educator, and she directed UMKC's Institute for Labor Studies for 29 years, retiring in 2018. She currently serves as a labor liaison for the UG Mayor Tyrone Garner, and who is also on the board of the Kansas City Jobs with Justice. Judy, thank you so much for being here this evening. Please take it away.
Thank you, Evan. Yeah, if you have any questions about safe and welcoming in that fiasco, I'm happy to answer them at the end. But anyway, so I'm here to talk about Honduras, and I'm going to share my screen and begin a presentation. But first, I want to ask you to put in the chat one thing you know about Honduras. And I'd like to start with that. You know what? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see what's in the chat. And if you don't know anything, you don't have to answer. But if you know something about Honduras, or you think you know something about Honduras, we'd love to hear it. Okay, so one person says it's family oriented. Now has a progressive government. That's right. Drug problems. Yep. Violence is prevalent. All true. JTF Bravo, that's Joint Task Force Bravo, which is a military unit, which probably the person who put that in knows more about than I do. They have a new president. Yes, Xiomara Castro. Anything else? Are most of you a blank slate? Honduran women are known for bravery. Okay, you know, I didn't get anything bizarre or just off the wall. Thank you. You know something. Well, let me start then. Oh, gangs, especially in the north. Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to start. Yes, Sotocano Air Base. Yep. Otherwise known as Palmarola. It's the largest U.S. base, and it's now an airport. It's part of it is an airport. Wait, that's not going to work. I have to share my screen here. Share screen. There we go. Share. Okay, can everybody see that? Yes, nod your head. Okay, good. All right. So I'm calling this talk Honduras Emerging from a Narco Dictatorship, which is the current situation. The cross-border network, which Evan already told you a little bit about us. We began in the 1990s as an organization that was trying to mitigate the incredible increase in Mexico blaming of Mexicans for stealing jobs. As Evan said in the beginning, I'm a labor educator, and I kept hearing from union workers in Kansas City things that were not very nice about how Mexicans were stealing jobs, particularly industrial jobs. And I knew that the decisions to move jobs to Mexico were not made by Mexican workers. And a couple of trips to the border taught me that those Mexican workers really had very, very tough jobs and were making a pittance. And so we decided to set up an organization and try to develop some people-to-people relationships between workers here and workers in Mexico who are working in the factories that are called maquilas along the border. And we got connected with an organization called the Coalition for Justice in the Maquiladoras. And we began to do support for organizing of workers on the border. And then Mexico dissolved into a narco disaster, and it became way too dangerous for people to be doing that kind of work, especially in the main place we would go. We built a school in Nuevo Laredo, which if you take I-35 down from Kansas City, you end up in, when you cross the border into Mexico, you're in Nuevo Laredo. And so we stopped doing that work. But one of the things we've learned in the process of doing that work is that a lot of the people who were working for General Motors, Ford, Emerson Electric, Sony, all those plants on the other side across the Rio Grande, most of them had family members who were working in the United States. And the reason that that was happening was because the maquilas, the US corporations, mainly US, were paying wages of hunger. And people could not survive on $4 a day. And, you know, for most of the time since then, that was in the 90s, Mexican workers, the Mexican minimum wage was somewhere between $4 and $5 a day. It was just recently raised to about $7 or $8 a day along the border. And so people would send family members, usually sons or husbands, into the United States to climb onto our roofs and fix our roofs and do other kinds of manual labor. And so we began to understand that there was a very close relationship between US policy, in this case, US trade policy, and migration. And that these migrants who were coming up from Mexico were not coming up because of any kind of neutral reason. There were political, economic reasons behind migration. And so then after we stopped doing work in Mexico, a few years later, we began to do work in Honduras. And we began to find out the same kind of thing. We began our work in Honduras in 2009, right after the coup d'etat, which toppled the government of a guy named Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya had been a reformer. He surprised everybody because he was a rich rancher, but he did things like raise the minimum wage. And get books for the schools and raise the wages of teachers. And he was beginning a land reform, which was sorely needed in Honduras. And he was overthrown by a conspiracy of generals, the bishop of the Catholic Church, and what's called the oligarchs, who were very, very wealthy Hondurans. And they, one night, in the middle of the night, June 30th, 2009, the head of the Air Force, General Vasquez Velasquez, came to his house in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, shot through the back door, kidnapped him, and went to the US base, Palmarola or Sotocano, and put him on a plane to Costa Rica in his pajamas. Honduras then erupted in protests. And these are pictures of some of the protests, because when I first went to Honduras in August of 2009, we saw massive demonstrations of people who had walked for miles and miles from all over the country to come to Tegucigalpa or to go to San Pedro Sula in order to protest this coup. And one of the things that was being widely discussed was, what was the role of the United States? Now, this was during the Obama administration. Our Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. And I wanted to know, what the US was going to do. And we ended up going to the US Embassy and talking to the ambassador, a guy named Hugo Llorens, who was a pretty high up person in terms of ambassadors. And he said they were debating whether it was a coup or a military coup, because if it was a military coup, they had to cut off their aid. But Hillary Clinton decided, even though he told her it was a military coup, she decided it wasn't a military coup. And so they didn't have to cut off their aid. And in fact, they ended up calling for new elections, despite the fact that Zelaya tried to come back. He came back, he was holed up in the Brazilian embassy and ready to come back into the presidency, which he had been duly elected to. But the US said no, that Honduras should have elections. And then they had elections, which were fraudulent, and the US recognized the results. So just to understand what the situation is and where we are, I have this little map. This is what's called the Northern Triangle, which is the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And I've just posted up here populations, and you may have to move the pictures. I know I do, your pictures or my picture. And this just tells you what the populations are and the poverty rate is relatively recently. Okay, Guatemala is the worst off. It also has the largest population. Honduras didn't have a poverty rate of 50%. And actually the new president says it's 70%. It depends on what you consider poverty. They didn't have that high a poverty before the coup, but they sure got it afterwards. And as a result of a lot of changes in the Northern Triangle, each one of these countries has its own particular problems, but there's a lot of things they have in common. And one of them is an overwhelming presence of the United States. But as a result of that, more than 2 million people have left these three countries since 2014. There's been a virtual exodus of a mass migration of Central Americans from the Northern Triangle who have moved to the United States or tried to. Many have ended up in Mexico. So I just want to say that there's a lot of myths floating around about these countries and about Honduras. And so, I just want to pull them out. One is the caravans, which began in 2014 and continue today, are because migrants believed that Barack Obama and Joe Biden would welcome them in. And that's why people left, because they saw that they could get to the United States, which obviously was a better place. And we had a government that was willing to take them in, and that's why they came. That's a myth, okay? Second, and you'll hear more about it. Second is that people leave because of crime, gangs, and corrupt and weak government. It's way more complicated than that. Yes, those are factors, but the roots, Kamala Harris talks about finding the roots of migration. the roots of migration go back to actually the Spanish conquest of Central America. And the third one is what Honduras needs is regeneration by the US. That's a perpetual mistake that the US makes over and over and over again in its relations with the Americas and probably other countries too, that somehow we can shape the solution to their problems. And, I just believe that that's fundamentally wrong. So this is a picture of one of the caravans. This one from about 2017, I think. And, what do you see here? You see lots of young men, but a number of women as well. You see people carrying very little with them. And you see people traveling together. And the reason they travel together is for security. They know that at least some of them will get through when they get stopped by gangs or police or military. And so the caravans became a means of trying to travel safely, even though it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's a very long trek. Honduras, San Pedro Sula, which is a northern city in Honduras, is 1,200 miles from the United States. And these are poor people. These are people who don't have the money to hire what's called a coyote or a guide. They don't have the money to take buses. They don't have the money to pay somebody to put them in a semi-tractor, in the back of a semi-tractor trailer where they can travel that way. These are people who walk most of the way. Now, for centuries, the Northern Triangle countries have suffered from institutionalized racism, beginning with the Spanish, and violence, which led to great inequality in authoritarian political systems. That has been the norm since the Spanish, after independence from the Spanish, by what were Criollo governments. And as one scholar has said, the rural poor have been forced to live an uprooted life, migrating from rural area to rural area in search of temporary work to urban areas where they join the ranks of the un- and underemployed, or to the outside, usually to the United States, from which they send remittances. Remittances is money that are sent back to support your family that's left in one of these countries. The fact is that migration is a continuous process. I mean, how was the United States settled? We were settled by migrants. We were a migrating people, and so are people in Central America. Very often, they're forced to migrate because of landlessness and poverty. And so, this is a long-term problem. And that landlessness began in Honduras, probably before a century ago, but very markedly through the displacement of industrial agriculture. The guy on the left is a guy named Sam Zimmerai, otherwise known as Sam the Banana Man. And Sam the Banana Man, in about 1911, he was an immigrant from Romania to the United States. And in about 1911, he got into the banana business, and he went to Honduras, and he found that the government of Honduras wanted to tax him. And so he didn't want to be taxed. So he went and hired a bunch of thugs in Honduras, in New Orleans, got a boat, went back to Honduras and overthrew the government. And this is the man who eventually became the head of United Fruit Company, today known as Chiquita. And he got free land, no taxes, and made a fortune. From that point on, the Honduras government was basically controlled by foreign and domestic oligarchs, and who picked presidents and made sure that the laws were favorable to the very, very wealthy. That kind of intensive agriculture, of course, created one, displacement of people, but also tremendous poverty and inequality. Today, bananas are less important in Honduras, but the reigning agricultural crop now is African palm. And that's what you see on the right. And peasants, especially in northern Honduras and the Yaguan Valley, have been displaced over and over again by oligarchs who have palm plantations. And palm, both in Central America as well as in Indonesia, has been a major factor in the impoverishment and the displacement of rural peoples. I'm skipping around a little bit because there's no way to cover all this. I'm sure most of you know that there were major wars in Central America in the 1970s, 1980s. And the fact is, US policy from World War II on in Central America was to collaborate with military and police to oppose any movements that wanted social change. Peasant movements, socialist movements, communist movements, all of them were opposed. The US armed the military in order to maintain the status quo. And in the course of that, of course, they supported dictators. And in the course of that, they also supported more US investment, particularly in export crops and in mining. So in the 1960s, actually, movements in Guatemala exploded and led to basically genocide in Guatemala. Then in the 1970s, these movements of poor peoples explode in El Salvador and in Nicaragua. I first went to Central America in 1970, and one of the clearest memories I have is being in San Salvador and being mobbed in a marketplace by children who were begging. And, you know, they were all around me. It was kind of a little bit scary, but it was just also just tragic because these kids were so destitute and so desperate. And after that, I walked into a bank to change money. And there was a bank officer there who spoke English. I didn't speak much Spanish at that time. And he sat down with me. He says, "So how do you like our country?" And I was like a little rattled because of these kids. And I said, "Well, it seems very poor." And he says, "You know why El Salvador is the greatest country in Central America?" And I said, "No, why?" He said, "Because we exterminated all of our Indians in the 1930s. And it was like, I mean, clearly that was shocking, but clearly it told me that there was a tremendous divide in that country. And I came to see it was also in Guatemala and Honduras, a tremendous divide between the people, particularly people of color, indigenous people, and the wealthy and the educated. And these kinds of social contradictions really explode in the late 70s. But of course, the US role is to repress them because they are seen as contrary to US economic interests and US political interests. And in the process of doing that, we made Honduras our base. It was the base for staging the Contra War in Nicaragua and for training Honduran military, including the famous Battalion 316, which was a death squad, which made sure that there was no successful dissidents in Honduras. And if you go to the Human Rights Office in Tegucigalpa, you see a wall of disappeared people from the 1970s and 80s. These were all young Hondurans who had opposed the US presence and had opposed the dictatorship in Honduras, who were disappeared and never heard from again. There's never been any accounting of what happened to those people, even though some of the people who led Battalion 316 were just recently in the government. So where are we here? Oh, sorry. So when Mel Zelaya became the president in, I think it was 2006, he, as I said, he surprised everyone by becoming way more progressive than people had expected. He was from the Liberal Party. There were two main parties, the National Party, which is more right-wing, and the Liberal Party, which is less right-wing. And Zelaya was from the Liberal Party. He began making these reforms, which I mentioned before, but he did another thing that was fatal. He developed a relationship with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and began getting oil from Venezuela. Well, I think that had a lot to do with why the Obama administration supported the coup, and lied to the public about it, and supported then his overthrow and the fraudulent election of the next president named Pepe Lobo, or Porfirio Lobo. Porfirio Lobo's son, by the way, is in jail in the United States for narco trafficking. Lobo served for 4 years and then was replaced by another coup leader who had been head of the Congress at the time of the coup, Juan Orlando Hernandez, otherwise known as Ho for his initials, J-O-H. Both of them were corrupt. Both of them came to power after stolen elections. Honduras became a narco state. I mean, just to give you an example, Ho, the guy in the bottom right, it's Zelaya on the top right. Ho, his brother was convicted 2 years ago in federal court in New York City as a narco trafficker and sentenced to life plus 40 years. Hopefully his brother will join him soon. The US, in the name of the drug war, militarized the country. Ho went to the extent of promising, his campaign promise in 2013 in his first election was to put a soldier on every corner. And so the army began to occupy the country. Honduras became a total kleptocracy. Most of the aid that the US sent was stolen in all sorts of fraudulent schemes. Excuse me. During COVID, there were a number of hospitals, portable hospitals, which were sent to Honduras. None of them ever arrived. Which is to say, they arrived, but they were never, they were stolen. Complete impunity of the corrupt officials, and massive, well, not massive, but incarceration of political prisoners in maximum security jails ordered to be built by the United States, and a massive increase in inequality and poverty. All of these things, along with this history of inequality and stolen land, are the ingredients, what Kamala Harris might, if she actually looked, call the roots of the displacement of the thousands of people who have joined those caravans. On top of all of that, we see the US pushing policies, not just the US, but the international financial institutions pushing policies that we call neoliberalism, free market capitalism, which lead to both the military transitions from death squads to protectors of the oligarchs, where you have the army protecting corrupt officials. You have an increase in foreign direct investment, opening up new commercial markets like maquilas in Honduras, which produce, check the label on your t-shirt, and I bet there's a good chance it's made in Honduras. Just about all the major t-shirt makers, and Hanes in particular, which makes your underwear, are there in Honduras, paying real wages of hunger. You have increased foreign direct investment in ports, well, in both agriculture, commercial agriculture, and in manufacturing. There was a negotiation of the Central America Free Trade Agreement in 2005. Also investment in tourism. The country became dependent on remittances from Hondurans abroad, you have extractivism of iron ore, of power, well, not so much power, minerals, heavy minerals, without processing. So they don't get the jobs. They just get, they get the mining jobs, but they don't get any of the secondary jobs that are created in an extractive economy. Privatization of government assets, electricity, water, pensions, ports, phones, electricity rates after the electrical system was privatized shot up so that there's a huge number of Hondurans who can't afford electricity anymore in the privatized system, and a high public debt, high interest rates, and the consolidation of banks into the hands of just a few of the oligarchs. And as all this is going on, poverty increases, inequality increases, and crime increases, so that, by the 2010s, San Pedro Sula in particular becomes the murder capital of the world. With a murder rate that's just incredibly high. And so with such crime, with gangs, and by the way, the gangs are mainly deportees from Los Angeles. That's where MS-13 comes from. These gangs then create the pretext for the US to push the militarization of the country. That plus the narco trade, which is, which is exploding. Honduras becomes the major transit point of Colombian cocaine into the United States. And there are little airstrips all over eastern Honduras where drugs are flown in and then taken down to the Caribbean and put on everything from high-speed boats to submarines for importation into the United States. And the US implements the Central America Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, which is like Plan Colombia and Plan Mexico. And it promotes, this is Joe Biden's plan when he was vice president, the Alliance for Prosperity, which pushes US dominated development from Mexico to Panama to guarantee social stability. That means no revolution, and security for US investment. These are development projects which are major hydroelectric projects and major transportation projects, major road development, ports, everything to basically bring more of a capitalist economy and more of an extractive economy to Central America. That's development from the point of view of the United States. Well, as all these forces combined, once again, you get a major protest movement. This sign says, "Get out, ho," for being a narco dictator. And the resistance, some of the resistance people form a new party called Libre, which means freedom or liberty. And there's constant protests. When we were there in 2019, the doctors were on strike and the teachers were all on strike because against privatization. Roads were blocked. It was, the country has been in an uproar for years. And then against everybody's everybody figured that Ho would steal the next election, even though he wasn't running himself. He had run illegally in 2017, and everybody figured he was going to have his party steal the election in 2021. But in fact, people turned out massively to vote, and Xiomara Castro, who is the wife of Mel Zelaya, who was deposed in 2009, has become the first woman president in 2022. And just to give you an example, the night of the election, when it became apparent that Xiomara was going to win, people were dancing in the streets of Tegucigalpa, singing "New York, New York," because they're hoping that Ho would be extradited to New York to face trial, which indeed is happening now. The United States has asked for his extradition. That's a whole other story. Tremendous celebration, but she faces tremendous obstacles and challenges. There's massive poverty. She says the poverty rate's 74%, with 53% in extreme poverty. Honduras's debt was just, increased tremendously under the corrupt governments. And it's now completely unsustainable. And it increased 328% from the year of the coup until 2021. It equals, the payments on the debt equal 59% of the national budget. So, or over half of the national budget, sorry. And there's no way they can run the country and pay the banks, the IMF, the development banks, the US banks, pay off this debt. They're either going to default or they need to have debt forgiveness, which is the major demand right now, is that the Biden administration help Honduras get debt forgiveness. The question is, what are the strings going to be? They have to root out a system of corruption. There's a plan to have the United Nations supervise some kind of investigation of corruption, but their corruption is pervasive. They have all these privatized systems, including the electrical energy system, that have been looted and investment has not been made. They're not very functional, and they can't, in so many, one of the first things Xiomara did is she promised that poor people would not have to pay their electric bills, which was very popular, of course. She does not have control of the Supreme Court for another year or so. Oops. She has no majority in Congress. It's brokered. Migration continues. There's just a caravan that was leaving this week. And she's under a lot of pressure from the United States. So she faces a lot of challenges. And what does the US want? Well, the US, loves to interfere. Mel Zelaya, when he became president, her husband, before the coup, he said the US ambassador presented him with a list of Hondurans who the ambassador thought were acceptable to become ministers in Zelaya's new government. That kind of interference, this is why, Honduras, it was called, they hate this term, it was called a banana republic. Because, like the interference from outside forces from the US was, regular. When Kamala Harris went, she didn't go to Honduras because of the corruption of Ho. She went to Guatemala and she said she was going to get to the root of the problems causing migration. And then she told everybody to stay home. Today, the US is doing summary deportations of people who are showing up at the border. I know a woman whose daughter, she texted me 2 days ago, and she said her daughter was about to turn herself in at the border, came up through Monterey and was going to turn herself in at the border station at FAR. And she wanted me to see if I could find her on the list of people who were detained. And I looked and I didn't find her. Well, it turned out she was in the United States for 2 days, was summarily flown back. She was back in San Pedro Sula yesterday. They never asked her. She never had a chance to speak to say, I want to apply for asylum. They're just, and she was on a plane with 100 other women with children. And she had a toddler with her. So, I mean, all this stuff about asylum, giving people asylum, we're just summarily deporting these people as they come in. And now we have a plan, which is more of the same, big brother kind of, we know what's best for you. We're going to get a bunch of corporations to invest, and we're going to give you jobs, and that's going to lead to prosperity. I just want to leave you with this, and we can talk about it. Ana Patricia Rodriguez, who is a Honduran scholar, says, the kind of regeneration that the United States talks about, she says, regeneration from the North comes to Central America in the form of imperialism, neocolonialism, and now neoliberalism. Put another way, a useful, if concise reading of history in the region teaches us that often it is a foreign invasion and intervention imposed under the guises of development security, and prosperity that create the very crisis they claim to be solving. And just to give you an example of that, I just want to talk about the recent case of 8 Wapino water defenders who were protesting a mine that was a partnership between a Honduran corporation and Nucor Steel, which is one of the largest steel companies in the United States. It was an iron ore mine which polluted the river and was done illegally in a national park. And these people, the people who depended on that river to survive, protested the pollution of their river. And these 8 guys were arrested and held for 2 years in pretrial detention, and were convicted finally, just as Xiomara Castro became president. And one of her first acts was to give them amnesty. And so they got out. But the kinds of arrangements that are made, which the US pushes, are often extractivism. They're often without the consultation of the local people. There's tremendous violation of the rights of indigenous people in these kinds of operations. And it's going to be very difficult for the new government to stop it because of the pressure coming from the US. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion. And I hope you have some questions.